The smell arrives before anything else. Not fuel, not exhaust. Something closer to a workshop on a cold morning. Resin and carbon and the particular dry warmth of a heat lamp left running overnight. The room is small. The lighting is fluorescent. The floor is concrete. On the bench, a panel. Black, flat, perhaps 3 feet across and no thicker than a man's thumb. It has no moving parts, no wiring visible, no markings beyond a serial number stenciled in white at one corner. A hand lifts it. One hand. The panel weighs less than a bag of sugar. The same hand holds a blowtorch to its surface. The flame is orange and direct. The panel does not buckle, does not soften, does not smoke. After 90 seconds, the hand touches the reverse side. Cool. Not warm. Cool. A man in a white coat writes something in a notebook. He does not look up. He turns the page and begins a new column of figures. The panel goes back on the bench. This is a Tuesday morning in Filton, Bristol. In 1987, a team of engineers at British Aerospace's facility in Filton, Bristol, completed the conceptual design of a reusable spacecraft that was lighter, cheaper, and more thermally efficient than anything the American space program had flown. It required no ceramic tiles, no post-flight tile replacement, no dedicated refurbishment facility between missions. The thermal protection that would carry it through re-entry at temperatures exceeding 1,600 degrees Celsius was built into the structure itself, woven into the skin of the vehicle from the first day of manufacture. It was made almost entirely from carbon fiber reinforced polymer, what the engineers called, in their quieter moments, plastic. No spacecraft built before it had attempted re-entry on composite structure alone. Today, no Project Zinnia vehicle exists. No prototype was manufactured. No subscale test article flew. The design documentation resides in the BA Heritage Archive at Filton, the same facility where it was drawn, catalogued alongside several hundred other programs that Britain conceived, developed to a point of genuine promise, and then decided it could not afford to believe in. The engineers who worked on it have retired. Some have died. The specific thermal testing data they generated in the late 1980s has not been published in the open literature. The composite materials that Zinnia proposed to use for atmospheric re-entry are, today, the standard structural material of commercial aviation. The Boeing 787 Dreamliner is 50% composite by weight. The Airbus A350 is 53%. Carbon fiber panels absorb and dissipate heat in ways that metallurgists in 1987 were only beginning to calculate, and the engineers at Filton had calculated them. So, here is the specific question this episode answers. How did the material that became the foundation of 21st century aerospace come to be judged by the British government's own advisors as too experimental for a British spacecraft, at the precise moment when British engineers had already proved it worked? This is not a story about failure. Project Zinnia did not fail. It was not tested and found wanting. It was never tested at all. What follows is the forensic record, the engineering rationale, the material science, the institutional decisions, and the specific sequence of events by which Britain arrived at the 21st century as a customer for other nations' launch systems rather than an operator of its own. If you want more stories like this, British machines and British programs that changed the direction of engineering and were cancelled before the world understood what they were, subscribe. We are building an archive of what Britain built, what it could do, and what ended it. This is that archive. This is Project Zinnia. The problem that Project Zinnia was designed to solve had existed since 1961. It was not a British problem specifically. It was the universal problem of human spaceflight. How do you bring something back from orbit without burning it up? The American answer, established with Mercury and refined through Apollo, was ablative heat shields, materials that burn away deliberately, absorbing thermal energy as they go. Effective, dependable, and, crucially, single-use. You flew the capsule once and recovered the astronauts. The heat shield was destroyed in the process. The Space Shuttle, which first flew in 1981, offered a different answer: ceramic tiles. More than 24,000 of them, individually shaped, individually bonded to the aluminium skin of the orbiter, each one hand-inspected after every flight, each one capable of being damaged by a piece of foam insulation the size of a briefcase. The shuttle's tile system was a maintenance nightmare of extraordinary scale. Between every flight, technicians spent months checking, replacing, and reattaching tiles. The program's operating costs reflected this. The shuttle was intended to fly 50 times a year. It averaged 4. The engineers at British Aerospace in Filton understood the tile problem clearly. They had been working with advanced composites since the early 1970s, first for military aircraft structures, then for civil aviation components, then for increasingly demanding thermal applications. By the mid-1980s, the Filton facility had accumulated a specific and largely unreplicated body of knowledge about how carbon fiber behaved under rapid, intense thermal cycling. The engineering decision at the heart of Project Zinnia was this: use the composite structure itself as the thermal protection, not tiles applied to a metal frame, not ablative material burned away in re-entry. The carbon fiber skin of the vehicle would absorb, conduct, and radiate heat in a controlled and repeatable manner, mission after mission, without replacement. It was called a thermal protection structure, a TPS that was integral to the airframe rather than attached to it. The analogy is the difference between wearing a coat and being made of wool. The tile system wore a coat. Zinnia was made of wool. By 1987, British Aerospace was the largest aerospace company in Europe by revenue, employing approximately 120,000 people across 14 major sites. The Filton facility alone, on the northern outskirts of Bristol, employed around 9,000, a workforce that had, in the previous 2 decades, built components for Concorde, developed the wing structures for the early Airbus aircraft, and maintained the most sophisticated composite fabrication capability in Europe outside of the military sector. Britain's position in the European Space Agency at this time was the 3rd largest contributor by budget, behind France and West Germany, but ahead of Italy. British industry held contracts across the ESA program, communication satellites, Earth observation systems, and the early stages of what would become the Ariane 5 upper stage. The British National Space Centre, established in 1985, was managing a portfolio of programs worth approximately £250 million annually. Within this context, Project Zinnia was a relatively modest research program. The figures available in the open literature suggest a team of perhaps 20 to 30 engineers at peak, working within a broader BA Advanced Programs group that studied future space transportation concepts. The program operated through the late 1980s without public announcement, without parliamentary mention, and without, as far as the available record shows, any formal treasury commitment to development funding. It was exactly the kind of program that Britain was good at producing. Technically advanced, intellectually serious, institutionally invisible, and chronically underfunded. In the late 1980s, there was a man working in the British aerospace sector whose name was known to almost no one outside a very specific circle of engineers, and who would, within a decade, be recognized as one of the most consequential aerospace thinkers of his generation. Alan Bond had spent years inside the classified world of British rocket development, work that could not be discussed publicly at organizations that preferred not to be named. By 1982, he had arrived at a concept he called HOTOL, horizontal takeoff and landing, a single stage-to-orbit spaceplane powered by an engine that operated as a jet in the atmosphere and a rocket in space. It was, according to the engineers who reviewed it in confidence for the Ministry of Defense, technically credible. The ministry classified the engine design in 1985. Bond could not discuss the most important part of his own invention. He continued working. The HOTOL concept was presented publicly in a version with the propulsion system redacted, an aircraft design with its engine officially removed from the discussion. The aeronautical press covered it with polite skepticism. The engineering community looked more carefully and found a great deal to admire. Bond was not directly responsible for Project Zinnia, but he operated in the same institutional world, at the same moment, with the same specific challenge. convincing British funding bodies that advanced concepts in space transportation were worth developing before the Americans or the Europeans made the decision irreversible. He understood, with particular clarity, what it meant to be right about something that the institutions around you were not yet ready to believe. Did you know that Alan Bond's HOTOL engine design was classified by the Ministry of Defense, making it impossible for him to publicly defend his own concept? Leave that in the comments. It helps more people find these stories. The engineers who developed composite thermal structures at BA Filton in the late 1980s did not disappear when Project Zinnia was wound down. Composite knowledge of that specificity does not simply evaporate, it migrates. The Filton site went on to manufacture the entire wing structure for the Airbus A380, the largest commercial aircraft ever to enter service, with a wing so large that it required a purpose-built factory and a dedicated road convoy to transport sections to Toulouse for final assembly. That wing is primarily carbon fiber composite. The thermal and structural analysis methodologies developed at Filton in the 1980s were part of the intellectual foundation on which it was built. Further, the specific problem that Zinnia addressed, how to protect a re-entry vehicle using integral composite structure, was solved independently by American engineers working on the SpaceX Dragon capsule in the 2000s. The Pica-X ablative heat shield that Dragon uses is a composite material engineered to manage re-entry thermal loads in precisely the way that the Zinnia team was investigating 15 years earlier. SpaceX patented their version. British Aerospace archived theirs. Meanwhile, the composite re-entry vehicle concept that Britain abandoned in 1992 is currently being developed by the Japan Aerospace Exploration Agency, by the European Space Agency's own Space Rider program, and, according to reports of the period, by 2 Chinese government research institutes. Did that surprise you? The concept Britain set aside is now the active frontier of 3 separate national space programs. Write that in the comments. The decision to build Zinnia's thermal protection into its composite structure rather than apply it as a separate system was not an act of optimism. It was an act of engineering logic. Carbon fiber reinforced polymer, CFRP, has a specific set of thermal properties that distinguish it from metals. It does not conduct heat readily. In the direction perpendicular to its fiber layers, CFRP is an excellent insulator. In the direction parallel to the fibers, it conducts and disperses heat efficiently. A structure engineered with deliberate fiber orientation can be designed to accept heat on one face and remain comparatively cool on the other, not by shielding against the heat, but by managing where it goes. The engineers at Filton understood that this property, applied to a re-entry vehicle, eliminated the fundamental weakness of the tile system, the gap between the thermal protection and the structure beneath it. Shuttle tiles were attached to an aluminium airframe. The tile absorbed heat. The aluminium must not. If a tile was missing or damaged, the aluminium was exposed. The result of that exposure on the 1st of February 2003 was the loss of Columbia and 7 crew. Zinnia proposed to make that failure mode physically impossible. There was no tile to fall off. The structure was the protection. The world that Zinnia was designed for was a world in which space access was about to become economically significant. In 1987, the commercial satellite market was expanding rapidly. Intelsat, Inmarsat, and a growing number of national operators were launching communication satellites at a rate that made launch cost a genuine competitive variable. The nation, or consortium, that could offer reliable, reusable, low-cost re-entry capability would hold a structural advantage in the emerging space services market. Britain's position in ESA gave it a lever. The Hermes program, France's proposal for a small crewed space plane to be carried on Ariane 5, was under active development from 1985. If Britain could offer Hermes a proven re-entry thermal system based on composite structure, the industrial work share would flow to Filton. The composite knowledge that BA had built over 2 decades would become the foundation of European human spaceflight. The engineering case was precise and defensible. CFRP thermal structures were cheaper to manufacture than ceramic tiles, reusable without refurbishment, and structurally integral to the vehicle, meaning the mass penalty of thermal protection was substantially reduced. A lighter vehicle costs less to launch. Less launch cost means more missions. More missions means the system pays for itself faster. The engineers had run the numbers. The numbers worked. In 1988, the British government conducted a review of its commitments to the ESA Hermes program. The Department of Trade and Industry, which held responsibility for British space policy, concluded that full participation in Hermes, at the level required to secure meaningful industrial work share, would cost more than the British National Space Centre's budget could accommodate. Britain did not withdraw from Hermes entirely. It reduced its commitment to the level of observer and minor contributor, enough to maintain a political presence within ESA, insufficient to secure the contracts that would have justified developing Zinnia's thermal system to flight standard. The specific institutional logic was treasury logic. Hermes was a French-led program. The largest work share would flow to French industry regardless of British technical contribution. Spending British money to develop British technology for a French program, when the return on that investment was uncertain and the time scale extended well beyond the next public expenditure survey, did not satisfy the Treasury's standard tests for value for public money. By November 1992, ESA had cancelled Hermes entirely. The program had overrun its budget estimates, its schedule, and, in the changed strategic environment of the post-Cold War world, its political rationale. With Hermes gone, the primary market for a British composite re-entry system ceased to exist. Project Zinnia was not formally cancelled. It was not cancelled at all. It simply had nowhere to go. The funding stopped. The team dispersed. The documentation was archived. Here is the specific irony of this entire story. The composite material that made Zinnia technically superior to every competing re-entry concept of its era was simultaneously the reason no funding body would commit to it. Ceramic tiles had flown on the space shuttle. They were proven. They had a known failure mode, labor-intensive maintenance and impact vulnerability, but they were known. CFRP thermal structures had not flown on a re-entry vehicle. They were theoretical, and in the calculus of institutional risk, a known bad solution outweighs an unproven good one every time. The engineers proposed test flights, subscale demonstrators, incremental validation. The institutional answer was consistent. Demonstrate it first, then we will fund it. The engineers' answer was equally consistent. We cannot demonstrate it without funding. That is the circle that killed Project Zinnia. Not the physics, not the chemistry, not the materials science, which was sound. The circle was institutional. The engineers needed money to prove the concept. The institutions needed proof before committing money. And the concept was never proved because the money never came. Read that again. Britain had the material. Britain had the engineers. Britain had the facility, the knowledge base, and the market rationale. What Britain did not have was an institution willing to fund the step between the bench test and the flight test. That is not an engineering failure. That is a different kind of failure entirely. The engineers were right. Carbon fiber reinforced polymer is today the primary structural material of commercial aviation and an active area of development in space re-entry systems. The specific thermal properties that the Filton team was exploiting in the late 1980s, anisotropic heat conductivity, low thermal expansion, structural integrity under rapid thermal cycling, are now documented in thousands of peer-reviewed papers, validated in operational aircraft, and being actively studied for re-entry vehicle applications by ESA, JAXA, and NASA. The material worked then. It works now. The engineers who said it would work were correct. The institutional verdict. Project Zinnia died by incremental starvation, a specifically British form of program death that leaves no single document to cite and no single minister to name. It was not killed by the 1957 Sandys White Paper. It was not killed by a single Treasury instruction. It was killed by a chain of individually defensible decisions that collectively produced an indefensible outcome. The Department of Trade and Industry reduced the Hermes commitment in 1988 for reasons that were financially rational in isolation. ESA cancelled Hermes in 1992 for reasons that were strategically coherent in the changed post-Cold War environment. Neither decision was made with specific reference to Zinnia. The program simply lost its market, its funding context, and its institutional home in sequence over 4 years without anyone being required to sign a cancellation notice. The strongest counter-argument is that Hermes was always an uncertain vehicle for British ambitions, French-led, expensive, and dependent on Ariane 5, which itself faced serious development challenges. A British program tied to Hermes was a British program tied to a French decision. The prudent course, the counter-argument goes, was to wait for a more favorable vehicle. The prudent course was followed. Britain waited. The favorable vehicle never arrived. The verdict is this. Project Zinnia was not cancelled because the engineering was wrong. It was not funded because no British institution was structured to bridge the distance between a bench-tested concept and a flight-validated system at the pace that commercially relevant space technology required. The engineers were right. The structure failed them. There was no last flight. There was never a first flight. What there was, according to the available record, was a series of presentations to ESA committees, to British National Space Centre officials, to DTI advisors, in which the Zinnia team set out the case for composite re-entry thermal structure and waited for a decision that did not come in time. Imagine the last of those presentations. Filton, late 1991 or early 1992. The room is a conference room in the BA Advanced Programs building, not the factory floor, not the test laboratory, but the kind of room with a projector screen and too many chairs and a window that faces the runway. Outside the runway where Concorde first flew is quiet. It is morning. Grey November light. The engineer presenting has worked on this program for the better part of 5 years. He has a folder of overhead transparencies, the medium of serious technical presentations in 1991, and a set of test results that he knows, with the particular certainty of someone who has run the numbers many times, are correct. He lays the first transparency on the projector. The material properties, the thermal conductivity curves, the mass comparison with the shuttle tile system. The panel on the table beside him is the same type that was tested in the laboratory years before. Black, flat, lighter than it looks. He does not pick it up. It is there as a physical reference. Something for the men around the table to touch, if they choose to. Some of them do. They lift it with one hand, test its weight, set it down again. They do not say anything about it. The presentation continues. The cost projections. The reusability analysis. The timeline to a subscale demonstrator. The engineering case is clear. It has always been clear. At the end, the senior ESA official present says that the Hermes program is under review. He says that no new work packages are being initiated pending the outcome of that review. He says this without particular emphasis. The engineer collects his transparencies. He rolls up the mass comparison chart. The men around the table gather their papers. Someone opens the door. The panel remains on the table. Someone will collect it later. The runway outside is still quiet. What did those engineers do when they walked out of that room? What do you do when you have proved something and been told that the proof is not enough? Leave your answer in the comments. Technical knowledge. The specific thermal characterization data for CFRP re-entry structures that BAE Filton generated in the 1980s was never published in the open literature. When the program ended and the team dispersed, that data went with them. Into retirement, into adjacent programs, into the general body of institutional knowledge at a company that was itself restructured, merged, and renamed multiple times in the following 2 decades. The engineers who knew how to interpret it are not in any laboratory today. The data exists, presumably, in an archive somewhere at Filton. It has not been publicly recovered. Craft lineage. The Filton composite program represented a specific and non-trivial combination of skills: materials, science, thermal engineering, structural analysis, and the particular craft knowledge of working with CFRP at the fabrication level. The apprentices who learned those skills in the 1980s are in their 60s now. There is no direct successor program. BAE's space activity was progressively absorbed into EADs and then Airbus Defence and Space, where the institutional memory of a program as obscure as Zinnia does not survive restructuring intact. The capability itself. Britain today has no independent re-entry vehicle capability. No British spacecraft has re-entered the atmosphere under British control since the Black Arrow program was cancelled in 1971. In 2021, 50 years after Black Arrow, Britain's national space strategy identified in-orbit servicing and re-entry as strategic priorities for the coming decade. The engineers who could have developed that capability retired a generation ago. What would it have cost to take Project Zinnia from the conference table to the subscale flight test? The figures available suggest a program of perhaps £40 to £60 million over 5 years in 1990 prices, comparable to the cost of a single frigate refurbishment or roughly a fortnight of the Trident nuclear submarine maintenance budget. Is that the number that stopped it? Project Zinnia was not cancelled because it was wrong. It was not funded because being right is not, in the institutional logic of British public expenditure, sufficient reason to proceed. The engineers demonstrated the material. They calculated the thermal performance. They laid out the cost case and the reusability argument and the market rationale. They were not asking for blind faith. They were asking for the specific, limited, and entirely reasonable investment required to move a validated concept from the laboratory to the flight test, at a pace that would have put Britain at the frontier of commercial space re-entry capability before the Americans and the Europeans established their own positions. The institutions declined, not because the engineering was inadequate, because the institutional structures for bridging that particular gap between bench-proven and flight-proven did not exist in Britain in 1991. They barely exist in Britain now. That is not a story about one program. That is a story about a pattern. Close your eyes and imagine it. The panel on the conference table in Filton, black as a winter night. Lighter than you expect. So light that the first time you pick it up, you almost lose your grip because your hand has prepared for a weight that isn't there. You hold a blowtorch to one face. You count to 90. You touch the other side. Cool, not warm. Cool. The material works. It has always worked. It is working right now, in this room, in this moment, on this table. Open your eyes. The engineers were right. The material worked. What failed was not the composite fiber or the thermal analysis or the reusability calculations. What failed was the willingness to stand between a proof of concept and a flight test and say, this is worth the cost of finding out. Project Zinnia is gone. The capability it would have given Britain is gone with it. The market it would have served is worth billions of pounds annually and is controlled entirely by other nations. If you want to remember what Britain built, and what Britain decided to stop building, subscribe. We are not done yet.